The Spirit's Book by Allan Kardec. Part 3. Moral Laws. Chapter 10. The Law of Freedom. Natural freedom.
Are there positions in the world in which persons can flatter themselves by believing they are enjoying absolute freedom?
No, because all of you, the least as well as the greatest, need one another.
What would be a condition in which humans could enjoy absolute freedom?
That of a hermit in the desert. As soon as two individuals are brought together, there are rights to respect, and they no longer have absolute freedom.
Does the duty of respecting the rights of others deprive individuals of the rights pertaining to themselves?
Absolutely not, for they are rights that have been granted to them by nature.
How can we reconcile the liberal opinions of certain men with their frequent despotism in their own homes and over their subordinates?
In these instances, although they have an intellectual understanding of natural law, it is offset by pride and selfishness. They know what they should do if their principles are not a well-calculated farce, but they do not do it in practice.
Will the principles they have professed during this life be taken into account in the next?
The more intelligence individuals have for understanding a principle, the less excusable they will be if they have not applied it to themselves. I tell you truthfully, that simple but sincere persons are more advanced on God's pathway than those who try to appear to be what they in fact are not.
Slavery.
Are there human beings who are meant by nature to be the property of others?
Every instance of subjection of one human being to another is contrary to the law of God. Slavery is an abuse of power and will gradually disappear with progress, as will all other abuses.
When slavery belongs to the customs of a culture, are those who practice it reprehensible since they are doing nothing more than following a usage that seems natural to them?
Evil is always evil. All your sophistry will not render an evil action good. However, the responsibility for evil is relative to the means at your disposal to comprehend it. Those who use the law of slavery are always guilty of violating the law of nature. But in this, as in all things, the guilt is relative. Because slavery was a custom among certain cultures, people practiced it in good faith as something that seemed natural to them. But their reason, more developed and especially enlightened by the teachings of Christianity, eventually showed them that the slave was their equal before God. Then, they no longer had an excuse.
Doesn't the natural inequality of aptitudes place certain peoples under the subjection of the more intelligent ones?
Yes, in order to enable them to develop, but not to demean them still further by slavery. Human beings have long regarded certain races as domesticated beasts of burden equipped with arms and hands, and have thought that they had the right to sell them as such. They have considered themselves to be of pure blood, the folly of those who do not look beyond matter. It is not the blood that is pure or less pure, but the spirit.
There are those who treat their slaves humanely, who see to it that they lack nothing, and who think that freedom would expose them to even greater deprivations. What do you say about them?
I say that they understand their own interests very well. They also show the same care for their cattle and horses in order to get more profit at market. They are not as culpable as those who mistreat their slaves, but they use them as merchandise nonetheless, depriving them of the right to belong to themselves.
Freedom of thought.
Is there something in human beings which escapes all constraint, and through which they enjoy absolute freedom?
It is through thought that they enjoy unlimited freedom, for thought knows no obstacles. Its manifestation may be hindered, but not erased.
Are humans responsible for their thoughts?
They are responsible before God. God alone can know their thoughts and condemn or absolve them according to divine justice.
Freedom of conscience.
Is freedom of conscience a consequence of freedom of thought?
Conscience is an inner thought that belongs to persons, as do all their other thoughts.
Do humans have the right to set up barriers to freedom of conscience?
No more so than to freedom of thought, because God alone has the right to judge the conscience. If humans use their laws to regulate relations between individuals, God uses the laws of nature to regulate relations between individuals and God.
Is every belief respectable even when notoriously wrong-headed?
Every belief is respectable when it is sincere and leads to the practice of the good. Reproachable beliefs are those that lead to evil.
Are we blameworthy when we offend the beliefs of someone who does not think like us?
It shows a lack of charity and goes against freedom of thought.
Does it go against freedom of conscience to obstruct beliefs that might disturb society?
Acts may be restrained, but inner belief is untouchable.
Out of respect for freedom of conscience, should we allow the propagation of harmful doctrines, or may we, without going against such freedom, seek to lead back onto the path of truth those who have been led astray by erroneous principles?
Certainly you may, and you should, but follow the example of Jesus. Teach by gentleness and persuasion, and not by force, since that would be worse than the belief of the one whom you desire to convince. If there is something that should be allowed to be imposed, which is goodness and fraternity, but we do not believe the means for doing so is violence, conviction cannot be forcefully imposed.
Since all doctrines claim to be the sole expression of the truth, by what signs can we recognize which one actually has the right to be presented as such?
It will be the one that produces the fewest hypocrites and the greatest number of moral individuals, which means they practice the law of love and charity in its greatest purity and widest application. By this sign, you will recognize which doctrine is good, because those doctrines that result in sowing disunion and establishing divisions among God's children can be only erroneous and harmful.
Free will.
Do humans act with free will?
Since they have freedom of thought, they have freedom of action. Without free will, human beings would be machines.
Do people enjoy free will from the moment of birth?
They have the freedom to act from the moment they have a will to act. During the first phases of life, freedom is almost non-existent. It develops and changes its objectives as the faculties develop. Since the thoughts of children are in proportion to the needs of their age, they apply their free will to things that are necessary for them.
Aren't the instinctive predispositions that individuals bring at birth an obstacle to the exercise of their free will?
Instinctive predispositions arise from those of the spirit before its incarnation. Depending on how much the spirit has evolved, these predispositions can incite the individual to reprehensible acts in which he or she will be aided by spirits who sympathize with such dispositions. However, there is no irresistible incitement if the individual has the will to resist. Remember, where there is a will, there is a way.
Doesn't our organism have an influence on our actions in life? So, isn't it at the expense of our free will?
The spirit is certainly influenced by matter, which may hinder its manifestations. That is why on worlds where bodies are less material than on Earth, the faculties unfold with more freedom. However, the instrument does not give faculties to the spirit. Furthermore, in this case, it is necessary to distinguish between moral faculties and intellectual faculties. If individuals have an instinct for murder, it is assuredly their own spirit that possesses it, and which transmits it to them. It never arises due to their bodily organs. Those who suppress their thought in order to occupy themselves with matter become like an animal, and even worse, since they no longer think about being on guard against evil. It is in this that they become culpable, because they act in this manner of their own free will.
Can a distortion of the faculties deprive humans of their free will?
Those whose intelligence is impaired by any cause are no longer in complete control of their thought, and thereafter they have no more freedom. Such distortion is frequently a punishment for the spirit, who might have been vain and proud and might have made bad use of its faculties in another existence.
It may be reborn in the body of someone who is mentally impaired, as the despot in the body of a slave and the spiteful wealthy person in that of a beggar. The spirit, however, is perfectly conscious of such constraint and suffers from it. It is in this constraint that one sees the action of matter.
Does the distortion of the intellectual faculties because of drunkenness excuse reprehensible acts?
No, because drunkards intentionally deprive themselves of their reason in order to satisfy their crude passions instead of one wrong they commit two.
In humans in the primitive state, what is the dominant faculty? Instinct or free will?
Instinct, although it does not impede their acting with entire freedom in certain things. Like children, they first apply this freedom to their needs. It develops later through intelligence. Consequently, you, who are more enlightened than primitive peoples, are more responsible for your acts than they are.
Isn't social position sometimes an obstacle to full freedom of action?
The world undoubtedly has its demands. God is just and takes everything into account, but holds you responsible for the paltry efforts you make to overcome such obstacles.
Fatalism.
Is there fatalism in the events of life according to the usual meaning attached to the word? That is, are all events predetermined, and if so, what becomes of free will?
Fatalism only exists when applied to the choice made by spirits upon incarnating to undergo this or that trial. Upon choosing a particular trial, they delineate for themselves a kind of destiny, which is the proper consequence of the position in which they now find themselves. I am referring only to trials of a physical nature. As for moral trials and temptations, spirits preserve their free will to choose good or evil, and they are always able to yield or resist. When good spirits see individuals lose courage, they may rush to their aid, but they cannot influence them to the point of eclipsing their will. A bad spirit, that is, a low-order one, can disturb and frighten them by exacerbating a physical danger. Whatever the circumstances, however, the incarnate spirit still retains its entire freedom of choice.
There are persons who seem to be pursued by fatalism no matter what they do. Is it their destiny to be unfortunate?
There may be trials which they must endure and which they themselves have chosen. Once more you blame fate, which is almost always a consequence of your own deeds. In the midst of the hardships afflicting you, make sure your conscience is clear. You will then feel partially consoled.
There are persons who escape one mortal danger only to fall into another. They seem unable to escape death. Isn't there fatalism in this?
Fatalism, in the true meaning of the word, applies only to the instant of death. When that moment arrives in one form or another, you cannot escape it.
Then whatever may be the danger that threatens us, we will not die if our hour has not come.
No, you will not die, and you have thousands of examples. But when your hour for departure comes, nothing will save you. God knows beforehand what kind of death will cause your departure, and frequently your spirit also knows it because it was revealed to it when it made the choice of this or that existence.
From the infallibility of the hour of death, does it follow that the precautions taken to avoid it are useless?
No, because the precautions you take are suggested to you in order to avoid the death that could result from the dangers that threaten you. They are one of the means used so that it does not occur.
What is the intent of Providence in making us incur dangers that will have no result?
When your life is in danger, it is a warning that you yourself have desired in order to turn you from wrongdoing and to enable you to become better. Once you escape this danger, and while still under the influence of the risk you incurred, you consider with greater or lesser intensity, depending on the strength of the action of good spirits, to become a better person. However, once the bad spirits, I say bad in reference to the badness that is still in them, return, you think that you can dodge other dangers just as easily, and you allow your passions to be unleashed once more. Through the dangers you incur, God reminds you of your weakness and the fragility of your existence. If we examine the cause and nature of any danger, we will see that in the majority of cases, the consequences are punishment for some wrong committed or a duty neglected. God thus warns you to reflect on and correct your wrongs.
Does the spirit know beforehand what kind of death it will suffer?
It knows that the kind of life it has chosen will expose it to dying more probably in one way than in another, but it also knows which struggles it will have to sustain in order to avoid it, and if God so wills, it will not succumb.
There are soldiers who brave the perils of combat with a certain conviction that their hour has not yet come. Is there any foundation for such confidence?
Quite frequently, individuals have a presentiment of their end, and thus they may have a presentiment that they will not die yet. This presentiment is given to them by their protector spirit, who desires to warn them in order for them to be ready to depart, or in order to rebuild their courage at times when it becomes necessary. It may also come to them from their own intuition of the life they have chosen or of the mission they have accepted, and which they know they must fulfill.
Why do those who foresee their death generally dread it less than others?
It is the individual who dreads death, not the spirit. Those who foresee it think more as a spirit rather than as a physical entity. They understand their deliverance and they wait for it.
If death cannot be avoided when our hour arrives, is it the same in regard to all the accidents that occur over the course of our life?
They are generally small enough matters about which we can warn you by directing your thought in such a way that you may avoid them, for we do not like physical suffering. However, this is of little importance for the course of the life you have chosen. Actually, bona fide fatalism applies only at the times when you must enter and depart this world.
Are there events which must necessarily occur, and which the will of the spirits cannot avert?
Yes, but which you, when in the spirit state, foresaw and anticipated upon making your choice. However, do not believe that everything that happens to you is written. As some say, an event is almost always the consequence of something you have done by an act of your own free will in such a way that if you had not done so, the event would not have occurred. If you burn your finger, it is only the consequence of your imprudence and condition of matter. Only the great sorrows, those important events that are capable of influencing your moral evolution, are foreseen by God because they are useful for your purification and education.
Can humans, through their own will and efforts, avoid events that were to occur and vice versa?
They can, if this apparent deviation fits into the general order of the life that they have chosen. Furthermore, in doing good, their duty and the sole purpose of life, they can prevent evil, especially that which might contribute to a still greater evil.
Upon choosing their existence, do those who commit a murder know at the time that they would become murderers?
No. They only know that in choosing a life of struggle they will incur the probability of killing one of their fellow beings, but they do not know if they will actually do so or not. Murderers will almost always deliberate in their minds before committing the crime, and those who deliberate about something are always free to do it or not. If spirits knew beforehand that as individuals they would have to commit a murder, it would mean they were predestined to do so. However, you should be very clear about the fact that no one is ever predestined to commit a crime, and that every crime, like any and every other act,
is always the result of volition and free will. Moreover, you always confuse two very distinct things: the material events of existence and the moral acts of life. If there is sometimes fatalism, it only applies to material events where the cause is outside of you and independent of your will. As for the acts of the moral life, they always emanate from the individual, him or herself, who therefore always has the freedom of choice. There is never fatalism in such acts.
There are those who never manage to succeed, who seem to be pursued by a bad influence in all their undertakings. Isn't this what we could call fatalism?
It could be fatalism if you would like to call it that, but it results from the choice of the kind of existence. Such individuals wanted to experience a life full of disappointment in order to exercise their patience and resignation. However, you must not believe that this fatalism is always unavoidable. It is often only the result of their having taken a wrong path that is not in keeping with their intelligence and aptitudes. Someone who tries to swim across a river without knowing how to swim stands a very good chance of drowning. It is the same in most events of life. If people did not try to undertake more than what was in keeping with their own faculties, they would always succeed. What causes their failure are their self-centeredness and ambition, which divert them from their proper path and make them consider a vocation that entails nothing but the desire to satisfy certain passions. They then fail, and it is their own fault, but instead of recognizing their error, they prefer to blame their horoscope. For instance, a man would have been a good workman making an honorable living, but he became a bad poet instead and died of hunger. There would be a place for everybody if each one knew how to occupy his or her own niche.
Don't social customs often obligate people to follow a certain path rather than another? And aren't they subject to the influence of others' opinions in their choice of occupation? Isn't what we call human respect actually an obstacle to the exercise of our free will?
Social customs are made by humans, not by God. If they submit to them, it is because they suit them. This is also an act of free will, because if they wanted to, they could reject them. So why do they complain? They should not accuse social customs, but their own foolish vanity, which leads them to prefer to die of hunger rather than infringe upon such customs. Nobody takes this sacrifice to public opinion into account, though God will take into account their sacrifice to their own vanity. This does not mean they should unnecessarily go against public opinion like certain persons who are more possessed of eccentricity than true philosophy. It is just as absurd to display oneself as an oddity as it is wise to willingly descend the social ladder without complaining if one cannot remain at the top.
If there are persons whom fate seems to be against, others seem to be favored by it because everything goes well for them. To what may this be attributed?
Usually they are better at self-guidance. However, it could also be a kind of trial. Success intoxicates them. They trust in their destiny, and later, they frequently pay for their success with cruel reversals that could have been avoided with prudence.
How can we explain the luck that seems to favor certain individuals in circumstances that depend neither on will nor intelligence, games of chance, for example?
Certain spirits have chosen certain types of pleasure beforehand, and the luck that favors them is a temptation. Those who win in the material sense might lose as spirits. It is a trial for their pride and greed.
Then wouldn't the fatalism that seems to preside over our destinies in the material life also be the result of our free will?
You yourselves have chosen your trials. The more difficult they are and the better you bear them, the more you evolve. Those who spend their lives in the selfish enjoyment of abundance and their own welfare are cowardly spirits who remain at a standstill. Thus, the number of the unfortunate greatly surpasses the fortunate, since the majority of spirits have sought the trials that will be most useful to them. They see, too, clearly the futility of earthly grandeurs and pleasures. Besides, the most satisfactory life is always full of events, and its
own problems to solve, even in the absence of suffering.
Where does the expression born under a lucky star come from?
It comes from an old superstition according to which the stars were connected with the destiny of each human being, an allegory that some people are foolish enough to take literally.
Knowledge of the future.
Can the future be revealed to humans?
In principle, the future is hidden from them, and only in rare and exceptional cases does God permit it to be revealed.
But if it is useful for the future to remain hidden, why does God sometimes allow it to be revealed?
This happens if a particular foreseen event would facilitate the accomplishment of things instead of preventing them, and if it leads individuals to act differently than they would have if the revelation had not been made. Besides, many times it is a trial. The foreknowledge of an event may awaken thoughts that are more virtuous or less so. For instance, if a man knows that he will receive a fortune that he had not expected, he may be taken by the sentiment of greed or elation about the probability of adding to his earthly pleasures. In order to obtain the fortune sooner, he may desire the death of the one who is to leave it to him. On the other hand, perhaps such foreknowledge will awaken good sentiments and generous thoughts in him. If the prediction is not fulfilled, it will be another trial, the way in which he bears the disappointment. Nonetheless, he will have acquired the merit or the blame for the good or bad thoughts that the prediction aroused in him.
Since God knows everything, God knows whether a person will or will not fail at a particular trial. If that is the case, what is the need of the trial in the first place, since it cannot add anything to what God does not already know about that person?
You might as well ask why God did not create human beings perfect and accomplished to begin with, seeing number 119, or why they must pass through childhood before arriving at adulthood. See number 379. The purpose of a trial is not to enlighten God about what people deserve. God knows perfectly well what they deserve, but to leave them the entire responsibility for their own conduct, since they have the freedom to do or not do. Since they can choose between good and evil, a trial has the purpose of placing them before the temptation of evil, leaving them all the merit for resisting it.
Also, even though God knows very well beforehand whether they will triumph or fail, out of divine justice, God can neither punish them nor reward them for an act they have not yet committed.